I'm so glad that you're here today. My name is Wendy Wiegmann, and I'm an instructor and a researcher here in the School of Social Welfare at UC Berkeley. You may have seen the description of this presentation, but I'm going to start again just sort of grounding us on what it is that we're going to discuss. In recent years, truth-telling about the racist and unjust history of the American child welfare system has caused reverberations throughout the country. Advocates, scholars, and social workers throughout the United States are looking more honestly and critically at the need for child protection systems and weighing the harms caused by the systems against their potential for social good. Some individuals want to abolish the child welfare system altogether. In this environment, a decreasing number of people are looking for opportunities to become involved. As I will explain in this lecture, protecting children and supporting parents is difficult work and complicated. So often good child welfare work requires that we hold contradictory ideas at the same time, or that we pursue two diametrically oppositional outcomes at the same time. You're invited here today because I'm genuinely and exceedingly worried that there's not enough people to do that complicated and difficult work. This is something that computers can't do very well. Hold these two opposing ideas, two different outcomes at the same time. As well, and more importantly, effective child welfare work is grounded in a belief in the dignity and worth of every person and relies upon the power of human relationships. That's something that computers know nothing about. That's something that they can't tap into. That's something that they have no idea how to work with, how to mold, and how to create something different with. So sit back and join me. Let's talk about why talented and caring people are still desperately needed for child protective services and the enormous reforms that we need to make the system more just and community-based. As a brief note, particularly on the next slide, as a part of this lecture, I'm going to share my own personal experiences with abuse and neglect. My story is difficult. It contains some terrible truths, and I may become emotional. It's just a part of talking about what's happened to you. Particularly when I talk about my mother, her picture will be up there, I might get a little bit choked up. If I get choked up, and I imagine some of you, kind people, will join me in feeling that emotion, I may do something called a straw breath. A straw breath is a big inhale in, and then purse your lips to make a straw, and then a very intentional long blowing out. That actually is very effective at re-regulating our systems, and actually I find that I can often keep it going and continue without sort of skipping a beat when I'm able to sort of take that breath and reground myself in the emotional moment. And it just sort of puts that prefrontal cortex back in charge and takes the amygdala and sends it over to the side. So if I have to do that, I hope that you'll take that straw breath with me and that we can all sort of breathe in this work together. Again, thank you again for coming today. So this is a picture of me and my mother. I'm at a very young age in this picture because this is when we were still living in Texas, and I only lived with my mother in Texas for probably the first 2 years of my life. My mother was rarely around in my young adult life because she struggled heavily with alcohol and drugs. Now, my mother was also an incredibly angry person, okay? She was abused and neglected as a child, as was my maternal grandmother. So my maternal grandmother was physically and emotionally abused by her mother, and because of the way that my grandmother internalized that abuse, she actually was overly permissive with how she treated her 5 children. And so my mother was exposed to a lot of really negative male exposure, a lot of sexual abuse, and a lot of neglect. And so my mother was extremely angry. She actually spent her 16th birthday in jail, trying to actually break out about jail. There's a lot of funny stories in my family. That happens to be one of them, about how my mother tried to escape jail on her 16th birthday, but she did it because she had started a fight due to alcohol, right? She was inebriated and started a fight. And this is at age 16, okay? Throughout my life, my mother was absent. And probably the biggest thing that I remember about my mother is a feeling of longing for her, right? Just wanting her to be with me. She would leave me with friends, she'd leave me with relatives, she'd leave me for anybody who would hold on to me for a week, a day, a month, sometimes multiple months at a time. Let's take that straw breath real quick. My mom leaving me with friends, strangers, and relatives was an act of protection in her view, because her life was actually characterized by chaotic, extreme violence. My father was a Hell's Angel. His life was about extreme violence and terror. He essentially used terror to sort of get what he needed to do done as a member of a gang. My mother was just angry all the time, in a relationship with a person in a biker gang, and sort of embodied that same extreme violence. Okay, so in her thinking, leaving me with God knows who and God knows what environment was a way of sort of removing me from the extreme violence that characterized her relationship with my father and with pretty much anybody that crossed her in her day-to-day life. I spent a lot of time with family members as well, and in a lot of ways they were a source of stability and comfort and normalcy in my life. I had a connection with who I was by being with family. I could understand the sort of long arc of my history. I truly belonged in that space because I was a member of that family, right? So this was a place that was a source of comfort, but there were a lot of drugs, alcohol, and violence amongst my family members as well. When my mom finally found a partner in San Diego County, here in the state of California, I actually got to move in with her. And we had what amounts to some better form of stability. At least I knew on a day-to-day basis that I'd probably be with my mom the next day. She may come and go. She often ran off for days, weeks, or months at a time. But at least I had a place where I was supposed to be. And that was in this home, this family with my stepdad. Now, there was violence between my mom and my stepdad as well. They continued to sort of drink. They used cocaine, methamphetamine, and alcohol, and they also beat each other up all the time. So a large part of my life is just sort of being a witness at a very young age, all the way up to age 16, of just all the dysfunction that you could possibly have. When referrals were coming in on me and my family, it included the entire book of things that you could allege, right? We had physical abuse, we had sexual abuse, we had emotional abuse, we had extreme neglect. Okay, and so I had this form of stability, believe it or not, and when my mom finally moved to San Diego and met this partner, she had 5 additional children, all little girls, all little sisters of mine. And I actually noticed that I had a huge developmental change in my life course at that phase. Instead of being worried about whether I was with my mom, whether I could take care of my mom, what was going on with my mom, I sort of shifted my gaze to my little sisters. Call it parentification, call it whatever you want. The sense of responsibility that I had to my little sisters, it was a lifesaver for me. Because in all of this chaos and tumult, there's a sense of like, what on earth am I living for? What is my purpose in life? You know, who has a life like this? And a sense of despair and a sense of not having any reason to be. And so my sisters became a sort of lifeline to me. My reason for being was to help look after them, to try and help them navigate this environment, to take care of them, to give them as much normalcy in their lives as possible, right? I remember there used to be 3-4 little girls right outside the bathroom, and every morning I'd stand at the sink, and one girl at a time came in to get their hair done, right? And I'd give this one liked her bangs down, and this one wanted a spout at the top of their head. You know, everybody has this one wants a braid, and all my sisters would come in and have their hair braided by me. And that to me was the connection, right? The meaning that I needed to sort of do something different for myself, to want something bigger, better, and more purposeful for me in my life, that's different than sort of perpetuating the abuse and neglect that had already spanned 3 generations of my family. Okay, 2 of my sisters had very specific and disturbing circumstances in my family. One of my little sisters was a stepsister. She was the daughter of my mother's new partner, and my mother hated her because she was the product of a different family, a different partner, right? April was scapegoated, physically abused, and ridiculed on a daily basis. A second little sister was born with fetal alcohol syndrome because of the substances that my mother used while she was pregnant. That sister, Shauna, was born with physical deformations as a result of her exposure to alcohol in utero. And my mother hated her as well because she was a physical embodiment of what I think is my mother's guilt about how her life was impacting her children. And so Shauna was actually put into a bedroom and not ever allowed to leave. She was trapped and contained in that room. She wasn't allowed to peek her head out. She wasn't allowed to talk to anybody, and she was certainly not allowed to leave. She had a lot of physical discomfort. If anybody's ever suffered a sinus infection, think about that and then turn it up to 100, because she had only part of her nose was formed and all of her sinuses were sort of a big old mess. And so any amount of mucus or whatever we have that happens in our faces and our heads was just all stressed up and bound up in her face. So she cried a lot, she had enormous physical pain, and she couldn't eat very well, okay? My mom would make my sister April, who she hated, beat Shauna until she ate something. And this happened every single meal of every single day, okay? We were investigated multiple times over a 10-year span of time. Numerous times. Teachers, doctors, neighbors would call Child Protective Services and said, somebody help this family, right? We were investigated. Almost every single time the investigator called our family and told us they were coming beforehand. And so by the time they got there, we looked like we were straight out of the Walters family, the Brady Bunch. We were perfect. Okay, everybody had a bath, a new dress on, and the house was immaculate. So when the CPS investigators came, it looked like there was nothing at all amiss in my family. But I have to say that, it's possible to be incisive, right? It's possible to look a little bit deeper than the surface level, but a lot of people were happy to just be told that nothing's going on. You know, it's kind of like, we checked the box, we did the home visit, now let's move on. Nobody ever spoke to me as the oldest sibling by myself. I could have told them loads, right? In addition, we also had some social workers that just came out there almost with guns blazing, already having judged my mother and determined that there was all kinds of terribleness going on, and they were just shut down by my mother. It was like a wall went out and no information was coming in or out of that family. We all knew not to talk to that person, right? I tell you this because I really feel as though the investigations that occurred in my family were superficial. Nobody asked the hard questions about the substances that my parents were using. Nobody asked what they were using. Nobody asked about the violence between my mom and her partner, how often she left and didn't come back. Nobody really asked the important questions which would have been necessary to, in fact, save us 10 years before I called Child Protective Services myself at age 16. I want you to reflect for a moment on what would have happened, how I would have felt, and what might have happened to me if I had made that phone call at age 16 and the response of the system would have been dead. Nobody would have responded, or they would have responded and really just not listened to me or believe what I had to say. Because I think that it's important that we always start our conversation about Child Protective Services with the fact that some children desperately need protecting. So, even after I entered foster care, the journey continued to be painful. And I had it the good way. I hand-selected my caregivers. My caregivers were the actual biological grandparents of my stepsister. I've known them for years. They were wealthy, religious, caring. They gave me everything I could possibly ever want. In fact, they took all the money that they received from my foster care and put it in a bank account. My very first car, a little blue Honda, was bought with the foster care funds that they saved on my behalf. At the same time, I also didn't belong there, and they reminded me quite often that I wasn't really their granddaughter, okay? They felt it necessary for whatever reason, and I have a lot of wisdom now that I can look back on that to be like, okay, I get it. You needed your family, and then you needed me, and you liked me, and you pat me on the head, and I was just okay, but I was also not a part of their family. I didn't belong there, and in a lot of ways, in my foster mother in particular, her eyes, I was a physical embodiment of the abuse that my mother perpetuated on her biological granddaughter, right? So even in the best of circumstances, you experience a lot of trauma in foster care, okay? I've had to do therapy for years about missing my mother and wanting her to be present. I've had to do a lot of work on the guilt and the loss of identity that I experienced not being the caregiver of 5 little girls. And I've also had to do a lot of therapy around being considered bad or not belonging, okay? About feeling inadequate. Foster care is the least preferable option. There's a common conception that children leave homes and get these palaces that they go into and that everything's hunky-dory from the moment that they enter foster care. But I'm here to tell you that that's not always true. It can be true in many loving homes. When I was on the board of directors for the North American Council on Adoptable Children, we love to tell those stories and make sure that that was the normal experience for children in foster care. But those aren't all the only stories. Many children might have their physical needs met, but their attachment to adults and their need for emotion is missing, okay? More importantly, foster care also disconnects children from their own histories, their stories, and the place that they fit in their broader narrative. And so we're always trying to balance these things. I don't think a computer can even get close to what I'm talking about right now. So, foster care is least preferable, but sometimes necessary. I don't think that my sister Shauna would have actually survived if the abuse had continued. She was not eating adequately. She was severely malnourished. Her physical deformities were causing long-term impacts on her health. And between that and just the emotional isolation that she was experiencing, I think she could have passed away. I don't think that my sister April would have survived emotionally. I think she would have been a broken person if she had continued to need to be ridiculed, abused by my mother, abuse a young child, and that would have been her life course. But she had a different way. She got to live with her own grandparents and grow up in an environment that put her on a different course. And right now she's doing fine. So is Sean. Sean is actually in a beautiful adoptive home that loves her completely and unconditionally and has always stood behind her. My success was possible by that. Shauna's success was possible by that. Even after I called CPS, my parents got sober for about 1.5 years. So there was at least short-term success, at least in treating their substance abuse problem because of the foster care system. But the system's complicated. My story is here to elucidate the idea that 2 things can be true at the exact same time, and only people can hold such a complexity. So we're going to go in depth right now into the complexity of the child welfare system. I hope I haven't scared you away. If anything, I really hope that this is a call to action, right? We can make a difference. We can say, like, help children, empower families, and give people a different course. But if people continue to run away from the child welfare system, nobody can help little Wendy's or little Shauna's or little April's out there. All right. We're going to start with the basics, specifically the evolution of child welfare policy over the years. I wanted you to just think, why is history, and by sort of extension, data, research, reflection, why are those all important things? And it's because that's how we learn. We learn when we research things, we study them. We even have a system that's not great, but then it grows into something different. With that being said, I just want to, and what we're going to talk about in a second, is that our attention to child protection is really new. In fact, the first major federal piece of legislation around child protection at all was 1974. It's not even on retirement yet. Okay? As such, I urge you all to take caution coming to any hard conclusions, whether the system's great or the system's awful, because it's still developing. It's literally a work in progress. Instead, I want you to see yourself as a part of this history, as a part of this evolution. Can you see yourself protecting children? Can you see yourself supporting families? How do you feel about your brain power? I sometimes love it when I feel that brain working. What about building a new community-based child welfare system focused on prevention and community engagement, right? I want you to activate the feeling part of yourself and the thinking part of yourself, because it's thinking and feeling that's how we make the system better. So what have we learned about the American child welfare system from a policy perspective? Children are abused. My story elucidates this. A number of other stories elucidate this. These are data from the California Child Welfare Indicators Project, where I work on a daily basis. It tells us a lot about the numbers of children that experience harm in our state. In 2023, over 49,000, nearly 50,000 children were determined to be the victims of at least one allegation of abuse and neglect. Okay, that is a rate of about 5, nearly 6 children out of every 1,000 children in the state. While the majority of children in those substantiated allegations, 71%, or about 35,000 of those kiddos, were reported for general neglect, 7%, or 3,500 kiddos, were reported for physical abuse. That's 3,500 children being hit, slapped, physically violated, and another 2,700 kiddos were reported for sexual abuse, okay? According to data from the Children's Bureau, and many experts consider these the lower bounds of numbers on what has actually happened, 2,000 children die nationally every year because of abuse and neglect. Now here's some, beyond the statistics, here's some other important facts. These statistics only represent a piece of what's happening. They refer to allegations that were substantiated, which means that they were deemed by a preponderance of evidence to be true. It's actually very difficult to substantiate a physical abuse and a sexual abuse allegation without a disclosure of a child. And an emotional abuse is very, very difficult, because you have to understand that not only did they experience sort of ridicule and emotional abuse, but that's having such a deep and profound impact on them that their emotional well-being is actually harmed by that experience, okay? In fact, a large body of evidence underscores the fact that the likelihood that a child is going to be reharmed is more closely tied to being reported or investigated than it is the substantiation. I'm sharing substantiation numbers because I feel at least we need a starting point to understand the prevalence of this issue. But I would urge you all to consider these statistics as really the lower bound of what is being experienced out there. Furthermore, these data represent only a single count of children, although many children, like myself, would have been reported for more than one allegation. So while these are only counts of children, each one of these children could be experiencing both the physical, the general neglect, all of these things, right? Recent data in California also tells us that 64% of children initially investigated for general neglect alone are later re-reported, and quite a substantial proportion of those children that are re-reported come back actually for physical and sexual abuse, okay? What is important here in all these statistics, before we get lost in the numbers and how to slice and dice all these numbers, is that quite a number of children are hurt. Some are severely and fatally hurt, and all need protecting. All right. It's been true, especially in America, but in many governments, that policy leaders struggle with the balance between family protection and family autonomy. Throughout American history, parents have had the right to raise their children as they see fit. This is actually codified by the Supreme Court in a case called Meyer Pryor v. Nebraska, who ruled that the 14th Amendment protects people's rights to, quote, establish a home and bring up children according to the dictates of their own conscience. This, we believe a lot in the Constitution of the United States of America. The Bill of Rights is sort of, I don't know, our song of unity, right? We just love it so much. It protects the right of family autonomy. And so for a long time, people didn't know how to operate around that. Also in early American history, you had things like farms or family-owned businesses, right? And parents were given discretion to use their children however they saw fit. If you need to work on the farm and you're not going to be able to go to school, that's just was considered, at least at that time, a part of the rights of parents to determine what happens in their family. There was no formal child protection services system in the United States until 1874, and even that wasn't government operated. That was run by non-governmental child protective organizations, okay? And those only came about after the case, this really horrendous case of this little girl named Mary Ellen Wilson that sort of embodied and finally was that story that everybody needed to hear about how severely hurt she was being at the hands of her caregivers. There was a lot of history of these non-governmental organizations. At first, there were lots and lots and lots, especially immediately after the case of Mary Ellen Wilson, and then there was this retraction, fewer and fewer and fewer. So at the high point, there were 300 of these non-governmental organizations doing child protection services work, and by 1967, there were 10. One advocate wrote in 1967 that protective services under public child welfare were reported to exist in 47 states, yet he said no state or community has developed a CPS system adequate in size to meet the needs of all of the cases that are being reported. In 1970, following a really impactful book, this one here, The Battered Child, and other articles that talk about and really elucidated what some children were experiencing, the federal government went into action. In 1970, there was a White House conference on children and youth focused on maltreatment. There was a subcommittee formed, and ultimately, Senator Walter Mondale, this fellow right here on the right-hand side, helped create and spur the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. Okay, that's the one I mentioned earlier, the very first federal piece of legislation that said, hey y'all, we ought to do something about abused and neglected children. CAPTA, as it's otherwise called, sets forth a federal definition of what child abuse and neglect even is, and provides funding to states for the prevention, reporting, investigation, and treatment of child abuse and neglect. This is why we have CPS hotlines, is because of CAPTA. Okay? Following the creation of CAPTA in 1974, the number of children removed and placed in foster care skyrocketed. It went up dramatically. In 1975, then, the Children's Defense Fund was like, well, maybe we should understand something about what just happened, right? They published an investigation of the U.S. foster care system finding, it looks like 6 things. Hang in with me, okay? Removing the children from a situation of abuse and neglect, removing them and placing them in foster home was the preferred course of action. When children were removed, placement with relatives was rarely pursued. In fact, some states had policies that didn't think that it was even appropriate to place a child with their relatives. Once a child left their home, the biological parents were not generally encouraged to maintain contact, sometimes were discouraged from contact, and there were no funds provided, there was no case services, nobody did anything. It was kind of like, we removed and protected the child, and that's what we needed to do, and then that was all that was done. Parents weren't even kept informed if a child was moved from one foster home to another, okay? When children were in foster parents, their parents were not given help to address the problems leading to placement. So substance abuse, domestic violence, those types of occurring issues, we either didn't have services or those services were not being provided to parents as a part of the system that existed in the 1970s. Even when parents didn't have any ties to their children, such as in a situation of abandonment, often parents' ties to their children, their parental rights were not terminated, which means that you couldn't actually have an adoption for that child, even though the parents were nowhere to be found. And finally, for children that did have their parental rights terminated, there were serious gaps in the process of adoption, and a lot of sort of misunderstandings and thoughts and misbeliefs that were not true about older children, children of color, and children with special needs being unadoptable, okay? So in 1980, the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act was enacted to address those concerns. It established the Title IV-E program of the Social Security Act, which essentially created what we have now in terms of providing services to families in order to get children back into either their natural families or into adoption or some other form of permanency so that children could have families, okay? Family preservation was one type of service that came out of this legislation, and it was often intensely involved, right? Round-the-clock home helpers, counseling, drug abuse and family violence services. Sometimes when available, they were short-term, they were comprehensive, and the child welfare worker had a caseload of up to 5 children, okay? That's costly. It's really difficult, particularly when you have a huge influx of children, to have caseloads of 5. You need a lot of social workers for that work. Much more common than this quote-unquote Cadillac model of family preservation, where service model is called family maintenance. We still have family maintenance programs in most of the jurisdictions throughout the state and the country right now, and they're similar insofar as the children remain home and receive support, but they're very different insofar as the court is still the sort of specter of court intervention, and child removal is the primary method by which social workers are trying to get parents to engage in those case plans. The comparison of family preservation and family maintenance, I think, illustrates a second tension in child welfare policy. The system works best when parents participate voluntarily and recognize that they need support. Too often, parents aren't in any place to do that. They're not ready, okay? So the system seeks to find ways. How do we compel people to participate in child welfare services so that children can be safe? When a program is well-funded, social workers can carry small caseloads, focus intensely on building rapport, and getting that sort of collaborative agreement that change is needed. Parents need a lot of coaching around that. I didn't mention this as a part of my history, but I was a child protective services worker for 3 years. I know that you can do it. You gotta sit down, it takes a while. They hate you for basically the first 3 months. But after that, you keep showing up, you're honest, you have integrity, you provide clear instructions, right? You're honest, forthright, you tell them everything that they need to know, and you deal with them honestly, and parents will just eventually come along with you. They start to see the light, right? But when programs are not well funded and workers are spread across 30 kids, right? We tend to rely heavily on the coercive control of the courts and cases, okay? The child welfare system exists in America. America has a history with slavery, genocide, and the subjugation of many populations, namely African Americans and Native American people. It's no mystery then that the child welfare system continues to have the sort of impact of that slavery and history in it as well, okay? Let's just bring this, I'm gonna take 3 or 4 slides to bring it all together, because we're like, okay, modern day child abuse and neglect and slavery, I'm gonna make those make sense to you, just bear with me, okay? Prior to the abolition of slavery, enslaved people could not marry. They couldn't enter any contracts. They were considered property or a commodity, and so there was no way that they could get married or have children. In fact, they had no rights to their children. In fact, because it used to be true that the social status of a child was attached to their father, many states during slavery times felt that it was necessary to carve out exceptions for enslaved people. Specifically, that the legal status of children was attached to the mother and not the father, because what they wanted was, in fact, for the children of enslaved people to themselves be slaves. Okay? I'm going to read to you a Virginia statute written around the time so that you can hear exactly what this sounds like. I'm going to give you a little bit of a trigger warning here. The language is ugly. I don't like saying it, but I feel like it's the truth and we need to hear it, okay? Negro women's children to serve according to the condition of the mother. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Land Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition to the mother, and that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay double the fines imposed by the former act. This literally was a piece of legislation passed only so that new children born to enslaved people would be slaves. And this wasn't only in Virginia, it happened all over the place. And all these laws meant until the end of slavery, the vast majority of African American people could not marry, nor did they have any legal rights to their children whatsoever. Instead, enslaved people lived with the perpetual possibility of separation through the sale of one or more family members, or simply movement. If a person died and their children inherited their slaves, those families could be separated. If one slave was sold this way and another one, basically families were torn asunder, okay? Historian Michael Tadman has estimated that approximately 1/3 of enslaved children in the upper southern states of Maryland and Virginia experienced separation during slavery. The use of unpaid labor to produce enormous wealth for individuals and for this country as a whole. Let me say the second part louder for those in the back. Slavery benefited the economic wealth of this nation as a whole, lay at the heart of slavery and the perpetuation and the continued feeding of that terrible practice. As illustrated in an incredible book called The 1619 Project, A New Origin Story, because of the power of this economic engine, Americans sought ways to legitimate the torture and cruel treatment and family separation. From religious arguments to blatantly false genetic explanations, but even more commonly, simple disparagement of character. Bad people, okay? In similar ways, the westward expansion of America put Native American families in the path of American economic progress as well. Native American people were dehumanized, derided as savages. Entire tribes were destroyed, and people and families were murdered, forced to move, and separated. This history has long arms, okay? When an entire nation of people seeks to sanction genocide or enslavement and uses lies and falsehoods to do that, those lies become accepted as truths over time. I believe there's a foreboding warning for us all right now in that message. I hope you're hearing that. The Indian Child Welfare Act was enacted in 1978 in a response to the crisis affecting Native American people. Okay? Studies revealed that large numbers of Native American children were separated from their parents. This is a picture of a young man after he's been put in a boarding school, right? There was an old saying at the time, kill the Indian, save the child. Okay? This was an effort to turn Indian children into essentially a sort of westernized American. Research found that 25 to 35% of all Native American children living in the country were being removed. And of those, 85% of those kiddos were not being put with relatives, even when relatives were possible. There's congressional testimony about this, and we got ICWA. ICWA sets forth federal standards about what you're supposed to do if you need to detain an Indian child. That includes providing active efforts to avoid that removal for the Indian family, identifying a placement that fits within ICWA preferences, which is relatives, tribal members, right, in a hierarchy, notifying tribes and children's parents when you have child custody proceedings, and working actively to involve a child's tribes and the parent in the proceedings. Because these added protections were both helpful to the children themselves and their families, but also attended to the unique political status of Native children, because Native tribes are considered sovereign nations, right? ICWA has been labeled a gold standard of child welfare policy by many experts and child advocacy organizations. One thing that we see sort of spreading out from ICWA is the ICWA measures to keep children in relative care is considered a best practice overall for all children, not just Native American children. Dorothy Roberts, a sociologist and law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, has brought a modern day perspective to this history. She argues that today's child welfare system continues to target poor Black and Native American families for family separation. She states that I point out the history of the system, which was never developed to be a system to really support families and keep families safe. It was from the very beginning developed as a way to deal with impoverished children's needs without having to actually provide for their needs. It is always targeted impoverished families, and for Black and Indigenous families, it has been a way as a weapon of war to destroy communities. She adds, one of the reasons this kind of government terror in families is justified or excused is because of the myth that children will be better off anywhere but with their families. That myth is supported by all of that justification that we did over those years, okay? Long-standing stereotypes about Black families, Black children grow up in disorderly homes where their parents don't care for them, and these stem from the institution of slavery and the separation of families during slavery. The myth that Black children and parents weren't really harmed because they didn't have bonds. She adds, I think one of the most profound and influential ideas that fuels the child welfare system now is the idea that Black children, even though they may be harmed by foster care, are still better taken away from their families than being raised by their Black parents and family caregivers. And that's the legacy that slavery and genocide is having on our current child welfare system, is the implicit biases that we developed around whether removing a child from their family is actually hurting them. We have these maybe stereotypes in our head. If the child's in foster care, they're going to be rich with loving parents that give them everything they want. And if they don't go into foster care, they're in this sort of disorderly home where they don't really have a lot of connections and bonds. And there's reasons that those can reside in our heads, right? We've been brainwashed as a country for a century or more, right? That this is a good way to think about people. 20 years after the passage of the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act, concerns that children were spending too much time in foster care led to additional reforms. We had this sort of remove all the kids, and then we had this try to get them back, and then we had this long arc where it was kind of a lot of kids were spending an entire lifetime in foster care because the system wasn't really great at figuring out when we stopped trying to get the child to return home to reunification and move to some other plan. And so children would languish. Parents wouldn't work their case plan. The worker didn't want to be the one to cut it off, and so they'd just sit there and sit there and sit there and sit there. But as I hope I elucidated earlier, children need to be in families. They need to belong somewhere, and children don't often just get that one wonderful foster home. In fact, many children bounce from home to home to home with the rejection and the trauma that's associated with that every single time they move. So in the 1990s, President Bill Clinton passed the Adoption Safe Families Act. That act created incentives for adoption, reduced the time period during which agencies could assist children from 18 to 12 months, allowed reunification services to be bypassed entirely for some children under some very specific circumstances, and allowed us to do something called concurrent planning, which is where we pursue adoption at the same time that we're pursuing reunification. So should this plan fail, we can sort of pivot and go to this other plan for a child so that the child is able to benefit from a family. So those are the policy lessons that we've learned over the years. I am going to have questions, but not right now. I'm just going to continue the lecture, and then I hope for a robust conversation where we all dig in and agree and disagree. But I'm going to just continue now, and we're going to try and think about what else have we learned about child welfare. What are the research and the practice lessons that we've also been able to develop through this time period? All right. Researchers and child welfare professionals increasingly recognize that client engagement is the foundation for change and positive case outcomes. And man, if there's a slide that I love more than any other slide in this whole presentation, it's this one. Because I love engagement. I believe that that's the one secret sauce that social workers have that nobody else knows anything about. When you come into a school of social worker, you learn how to show up for people when they're experiencing the worst day of their life, and you learn how to journey with them through that fire, being the best that you can be and believing that you're pulling from them and calling to the present the best of who they are. And there ain't another profession in the entire world that does that thing. That's the one thing social workers do, is we walk alongside people when they're having the worst day of their life, and we believe that at the end of that, there's a good person trying to do the right thing that's really encumbered by the worst kind of circumstances. And so this is social work, okay? Engagement can be hard to define. Okay, a lot of studies have tried to study different elements of what is engagement even. In 2020, it was about strengths-based practice, right? Trying to build on what people have in terms of resources and get them to utilize those resources to address maltreatment risks. Studies have found that when people have a strength-based approach, not only do parents respond to that and have better case outcomes, but they actually start to take the work on themselves. So instead of relying on the system, they start to look to them own selves for solutions. A different study found that some simple things matter to engagement. Having less than 2 workers means a lot to parents. Having more recent contact, receiving timely, responsive services, and it was associated with a better quality relationship. So parents aren't even saying, I like it when my social worker tells me everything I want to hear. They really just want social workers to show up, okay? Another study by Gladstone and others revealed that some caseworkers' skills and behaviors explained whether parents engaged or not. These are the extent to workers are ignoring problems that the parents perceive are important, if workers ask parents to do things that the parents don't feel are going to be helpful, workers' skills in locating essential services, making and returning phone calls, engaging parents in the case planning process, being caring and supportive, praising parents when they make efforts, right? These are the things that matter to parents. One other study, and this may be the last one that I share about engagement, empathy, trustworthiness, respect. You can have empathy, be trustworthy, and show respect and still feel as though a child needs protecting from a parent. I'm here to tell you, I have those conversations, or used to, all the time. I see you, I respect you, I believe that you can be the parent that you want to be, but right now, your child is not safe, right? You say that, people can hear those words, but you have to be an honest communicator around that, okay? Other behaviors, providing concrete, specific, clear instructions, training on what behaviors we actually expect parents to exhibit, okay? Applying positive reinforcement, collaboration, being attentive to the entire family. And then finally, there was one last study and said they boiled it down to sort of 2 things. Soft, mindful, judicious use of power. And number 2, a humanistic attitude that sees people first, right? This is what parents want and need to be successful. What I love about this literature is what parents want is not just, give me my kids back. It's not just like, I want what I want. It's like, if you're going to be a social worker, then show up as a social worker. And so what I'm describing to you are some of the things that have been empirically studied as what is social work? What does engagement even really mean? And it's not difficult. What's difficult is when you have to exhibit those behaviors and you're also feeling torn, or you yourself are worried, or you're afraid of parents, or you don't know how to say the two things at the same time. And that can improve with training and practice. We'll talk about that at the end of this lecture. Multiple studies, including one in California, indicate that Black and Native American children are reported, investigated, and detained at significantly higher rates than white children. Black and Native American children also experience termination of parental rights at much higher rate. A number of researchers have tried to study why is this true. And most of the studies that have done this have sort of boiled it down. There's 3 key reviews, and they all came up with sort of 4 big buckets. Why does this racial disparity exist? Number 1, disproportionate needs resulting from poverty and related risk. And that includes, being homeless, mentally ill, violence, as well as substance use. Those things are associated with poverty, okay? In their study, the researchers often admit that there's a mixed evidence about those connections. Because while there's a robust connection between family risk and race and ethnicity over here, and then also a direct link between poverty and maltreatment, they haven't quite connected the sort of whole chain of events that show that race and ethnicity and the specific types of risk and poverty that they experience leads to those child maltreatment risks. But let it be said that there's associations between being in poverty, experiencing quite a number of sort of behavioral problems when you're in poverty, and then those having profound impacts on children. Studies have also that tried to control for poverty and other risk factors have continued to document differences by race. And so that brings us to point number 2, which is racial bias and discrimination amongst child welfare staff and mandated reporters, as well as institutional bias in policies and practices. Preponderance of evidence shows us that Black folks are over-surveilled. They receive quite a number of public services, and with those public services come a lot of eyeballs, right? So there's a lot of surveillance on Black families, and those can tend to lead to a greater rate of CPS referrals as well. Evidence also suggests that community reporters are more likely to report a Black family than a white family, even given the same circumstances, however. So it gets a little bit more than the surveillance. It's also about whether we perceive safe versus non-safe for a family of color versus not. Finally, some studies have documented that child welfare staff might also have biases concerning families of color, and that impacts the entire continuum of the child welfare system. Moving beyond the individual and systemic biases to number 3, research has documented that child welfare system factors such as lack of resources in communities where people live also influence the disparity in outcomes that we see for Black families in particular. Resources are not in the communities where they need to be. Finally, number 4, geographical context. And I really want you to hear me about geographical context because the research is really fascinating and exciting here around geographical context. Not only is sort of concentrated poverty sort of mitigate or create additional risks for maltreatment for children, but when you have strengths in neighborhoods, those can be extremely protective, okay? Economic things like income levels and employment rates lead to maltreatment, but social integration, where community members are connected to one another and to the community spaces where they get involved in each other's business, watch each other's children, call each other out, those actually are really protective. I'm going to get to why that's important later, because I want us to all see ourselves as sort of multi-level practitioners. And there's work, there's beautiful, good, rich work that can be done in communities. And so even if you can kind of identify yourself as like, yeah, I'm feeling it for CPS, I want you to see that there's a lot of work that you can do in communities as well, and that's actually really great, beneficial, and heart-filling work. All right. In recent years, attention has been placed back on this disproportionality and disparities with stronger connections to that history we mentioned earlier in our policy discussion about slavery, family separation, and genocide. In an article by Detlef and Boyd, one of those authors was an alum of our program. Authors argue that risk factors such as poverty and neighborhood conditions result from an underlying factor, which is structural and institutional racism. They ask this really great provocative question: how have risk factors for maltreatment become concentrated amongst Black families? And that's a question that we should all think about in our lives. Not as social workers, but as people in this society. All right? They then focus on the link between racism and risk factors, arguing that racism is not just a personal ideology that comes out of racial prejudice, but it's a part of the system. Okay? So, their 4 points in this argument is racism's been here since the country was born. And we talked about that earlier. As we justify slavery, we find ourselves accepting non-truths about who's worthy and unworthy, right? But they take it one step further. Following the end of slavery, multiple states enacted a series of laws, policies, and systems to maintain white supremacy and reinforce inequity. Those Black codes, this is an example here of one, restricted the freedom of Black people. They couldn't move around, they couldn't be unemployed. Furthermore, other Black codes made misdemeanors and trivial offenses felonies, leading to the sort of mass incarceration that we see nowadays, as well as harsh sentences and fines. Black codes also prohibited interracial marriage, cohabitation. They restricted the practice of Black individuals to practice any profession that was not menial labor, practically re-enslaving them, right? They denied voting rights to Black citizens, they controlled where Black folks could live, and they even included provisions to seize Black children for labor purposes. So we don't even have to go all the way back to slavery to see the legacy on this in child welfare. We can go just past to the Black codes, which, remember, the civil rights movement was in the 1960s. We are still dealing with very recent history here, folks. Second point made by Detlef and Boyd is that there's a relationship between racism and poverty. Because of the Black codes, because of everything else, if you've never heard of redlining, go and Google it as soon as this lecture is over, right? Because of all of these laws and policies that lifted and held up white supremacy, we have disparities in residential segregation, labor markets, and unequal access to quality education. Individually and cumulatively, these remnants of white supremacy are perpetuating the concentration of poverty in Black families. This is important because then if we're going to sit really hard on that idea that poverty is connected to risk, we can't entirely just point at the families and be like, you're poor, get a hold of yourself, right? Because that's missing 75% of the picture. Detlef and Boyd also point out the connections between racism, health, and stress. There's lots of studies that show that when you experience racism on a day-to-day basis, that your body is extremely stressed out. When we were doing straw breaths earlier today, guys, we were calming our trauma responses, okay? But I just traumatized you for a quick second. Imagine that your day-to-day life, from the moment you get up until you go to sleep at night, is like one racist episode after another, stressing you out the whole day through. And stress is related to maltreatment risk as well. I think if I were to ask you to do something really, really hard on a day that you're either sick or tired or you're in pain, you would find it very difficult to do that really, really hard thing. And I'm just going to share a little bit about you. I've had to do a lot of therapy around it, but like, I've been stressed out and yelled at my children. I've been unkind to my own children. You know, it just happens. And I went to therapy. I'm like, I'm not dealing with my stress very well, therapist. Can you help me so that when I'm feeling super stressed, I don't feel a need to yell and scream and belittle my children. And I'm in a different place now, but that took work. But I'm telling you again, just a little tiny piece of this so that you can, I want you to internalize these messages, right? I'm just like research. It's all coming at you. It's becoming quite dry. And so every once in a moment, like, let's tap back into our own selves as people and realize that what we're describing is like human reaction to real stimuli. Finally, there's a relationship between racism and those geographic contexts, right? Whether or not communities are thriving, giving each other resources, there's mutual support, there's happiness and benefits to children and their families in a community is also determined by where you live, and where you live is determined by your race and ethnicity in this country. But still, some of us may be struggling to connect what we see now in 2025 to the pattern described by Detlev and Boyd. In recent history, schools of social work, including this one, have emphasized anti-oppressive and anti-racist practice, awareness of implicit bias, cultural humility, the importance of engagement, person and environment, right? Considering poverty, considering it all. So how do we square the truths that people are trying to do the right thing? They're getting this education. They're leaving schools of social work ready to do the good work, and the persistent disparities that we see in child welfare outcomes. In the recent study, this one here by Lebrenz and her colleagues, they did a qualitative study trying to talk to social workers. How do you manage these biases? What are you doing? Like, how is it happening for you? They found that across the decision-making process, professionals report navigating all of this, right? Trying to control what I experienced as a child with my professional expectations of parents, separating my personal values from my professional roles. At the micro level, professionals are trying to separate their professional selves from their personal selves, acknowledging that their background influences their perception. At the meso level, professionals are struggling to set realistic goals for families within the time constraints set by the law. And then at the macro level, professionals really struggle with, God, these families are struggling with so much, and my system doesn't even try to help with most of that, right? Ultimately, deconstructing bias involved first internalizing and then attempting to reconcile all of these paradoxes. But social workers, after a period of time, they end up alienated and frustrated with the failure of the system to actually help in the idealized way that they would like to be helping. And so what they found is that social workers tend to give up. Right? They just kind of adopt the regular standard paradigm, and they go back to practice as not quite great, but normal, right? Let's use the courts to turn the screws, to get the compliance so that we can do the things and check the boxes, right? And they forget all that wonderful stuff about engagement and social justice, right? And a multi-level framework for understanding people's problems. There's parallels to today as well. I'm going to remind you of the quote from Dorothy Roberts earlier. A way to deal with impoverished children's needs without actually having to provide for their needs. Nevertheless, I want to cheer you guys up a little bit. It's becoming increasingly clear to child welfare researchers as well as practitioners that families and communities have strengths. And here's the good news, folks. These strengths can be utilized to keep children safe. So there's strengths at the individual level, self-regulation, social competence, adaptive functioning, etc., right? Those things help. At the interpersonal level, there's some really cool stuff going on. I think we all know about this kind of intergenerational cycle of abuse. That's been validated by research. But research has also found that a caring and loving partner that kind of reverses the script on how we deal with each other and with children and goes to kindness and love can actually change a person who's been violated into somebody who embraces compassion and love. That is true of my case as well. My partner has made a big difference in my life. Support outside of romantic relationships have also protected against maltreatment. In a population-based study of California, emotional support, having friends to share worries with, was associated with lower frequency of parent self-reported physical abuse. Another study said that family support was also associated with lower frequency of maltreatment. So people benefit when they have people around them. In fact, one of the biggest risk factors for abuse and neglect is when families are isolated, particularly single parents. When they're isolated all alone, it's just them and those kids. It's a very, very dangerous situation, considering the load of stress that that parent is under. More recently, we've looked at that at the sort of community and societal level. I mentioned earlier the goodness that happens when they have mutual trust, mutual support amongst neighbors, so I won't go into that as well because I've already sort of said it, but how about some studies that showed that social and economic policies also make a difference, okay? Policies such as increasing household incomes amongst families with paid parental leave or earned income tax credits, increases in the minimum wage, more generous welfare benefits, those have all been associated with lowering rates of child maltreatment, okay? Results from a number of these studies that have looked at these larger policy impacts have also shown that modest increases, it doesn't even have to be big, in family income due to these policy changes are associated with population level declines in maltreatment, suggesting that when we don't need to have dramatic improvements to reduce the rate of child maltreatment. And so I want to tap into some of your guys' interests. We all see ourselves in different ways. Some of us want to work one-on-one with children. Some of us want to work one-on-one with families. Some of us want to work at systems level, and some of us see ourselves in the policy realm. There's a role for every single one of us in child welfare. And I would say we all need to be in child welfare because what I'm going to say at the end of this, and it bears repeating, is that the child welfare system has tended to neglect those system and larger levels and the impacts that those can have on child maltreatment. I believe that that can change, but we need people to show up to do it. As part of the child welfare process, caseworkers have to develop a case plan. Okay, and there's a lot of debate. Should the case plan have a service for every single need that we notice in the family, or should it be tailored so that families can accomplish their case plan goals within the time limits that are set by the law? There's research pulls in a couple of different directions on that. There's a lot of good research that shows that when services are matched to needs, reunification is more likely. But some of those same exact studies, such as one that focused explicitly on substance abuse treatment, showed that it was extremely helpful that all of those service needs were met in a single location. The substance abuse treatment program itself was providing the parenting, the economic, all the things. That's very different than having 5 different services and needing to go here on Tuesday and there on Wednesday and there on Thursday. And by the way, don't lose your job, right? All of those things all at once, pulling parents asunder, okay? Best practice guidelines tell us that we should case plan with families. Data suggests that people don't do that, okay? A number of jurisdictions throughout the country are always self-reporting. Actually, we're not doing a great job of case planning with the families, okay? Importantly, some studies are still finding, however, and this is, again, my call to action to kind people. While the purpose of the case plan is to outline services that are going to get families safer, compliance and deference to authority are being held up as what is important. A lot of caseworkers are taking the shortcut of saying, well, if the parent would cared about their children, they would just do all these case plans and they would respect my authority and the authority of the court. And so they're looking for these signs of embarrassment or regret or just simple acceptance of authority as a signifier that that family is more safe. Those two things aren't the same. More importantly, there's nothing collaborative and family or parent-centered about that approach. It's very coercive, it's very authoritarian, it's not a really good way to actually imbue true and lasting changes in an individual. Because guess what, my mother could comply with any case plan for a short duration of time. What we needed my mother to do was actually change her life. And as long as she was like, I just want the social worker to go away, she wasn't really doing that deeper work. Okay. We're bringing it on home soon. Having reviewed the key factors that make a difference in child welfare outcome, we start to get a picture of the complexity of the social worker's role. The ability to engage with involuntary clients using an anti-oppressive, anti-racist framework, which attends not only to those individual and interpersonal factors, but the community and larger social policy, sounds really hard. On top of that is supporting families as they navigate things like substance use, domestic violence, and mental health issues. One program implemented in many states to recruit, retain, and train a more specialized child welfare workforce that can do all that magic at the same time is the Title IV stipend program. Through the 4E funds from the Social Security Act, universities can partner with local child welfare organizations and get folks to move through a program and essentially get the skills that they need to be in the child welfare workforce and then go directly into that child welfare workforce. To enhance their job readiness and effectiveness, Title IV programs are provided with enhanced child welfare curriculum that focus on doing this work that we're talking about today. Public child welfare placements in their usually second year so that your field placement is there doing the work in real time. And student stipends. At Berkeley, we offer a 4E stipend of about $2,500 a month for a total of $25,000 for the school year to students pursuing a master's in social work with a specialization in child welfare. Research has indicated that these types of 4E programs are not only associated with a diversification of the workforce, but also diversification in leadership roles. Furthermore, a caseworker's educational background and training influence family reunification. Numbers and numbers of studies have shown that social workers with master's degrees are more likely to reunify families. 4E is associated with higher levels of reunification, right? Lots of goodness comes from learning these skills because they don't come naturally. They're very difficult. And that's why I'm here today. Literature on child welfare clearly indicate that caring and dedicated people are needed, but that both the staff and families benefit when those individuals receive specialized training. So what's the bottom line here? People matter. They matter a lot. They matter more than anything else, okay? The ways that people conduct child welfare work determine whether children are unnecessarily involved, what happens to children and families when they become involved, whether the length of time that families stay involved, and what happens afterwards. Okay? The idea that people mattered is embodied in the Social Work Code of Ethics, which states that social works respect the inherent dignity and worth of people, and that we recognize the central importance of relationships to change. And because people matter, it's important, even essential, that individuals who are interested in protecting children and empowering families are reflective, even critically reflective, about the child welfare system. This is my way of saying that if you think that the child welfare system is racist right now, please come and help it be less racist. Don't run away, okay? This is a system in development. It doesn't develop in an echo chamber. It doesn't develop with old folks still carrying the old guard. We need fresh blood in this work to continue our evolution. I mentioned earlier that there's a little bit of debate. Should we abolish the child welfare system? And it's sort of it's raging, and people are arguing both sides of it. And the problem, the concern that I around this debate is its dichotomous nature. Some folks are kind of like, because there's all this racism and continued evidence of bias, abolish the system. And then other folks are like, oh, no, those statements of bias are overstated, right? Those aren't true. They're somehow exaggerated. Neither side is arguing about the facts that I shared with you today. Some children are harmed, even fatally harmed by their parents, okay? Black children and Native American children have the most exposure to the child welfare system. Children have a desperate need to be in families, particularly families that help them understand themselves, their history, and their communities. Families benefit from competent child welfare staff who are skilled at engagement, balanced assessment, tailored case plans, service and system navigation. Poverty and associated risks are critical, but strengths at the individual, the interpersonal, the community, and the societal level help. They change things. And finally, the child welfare system has not traditionally addressed poverty or geographic context. We seem stuck, focusing on individual and interpersonal relationships, right? We're stuck looking this big at the system, okay? Even worse, compliance and deference to authority. That's the worst of the worst that you can get in child welfare. We cannot abolish the child welfare system. I make no bones about it. I'm not even sitting on the line there. My answer is no. Without addressing the racism and its associated child maltreatment risk factors such as residential segregation, discrimination in labor markets, unequal access to quality education, resources, stress, race-related stress, blighted neighborhoods, we have no sense that what will come in the absence of the formal child welfare system is going to be any better than what we have now. Remember that practices like orphan trains or the boarding schools were not perpetuated by government. They were perpetuated by these private, non-governmental, small organizations, right? So it's not like we're gonna just erase racism by shifting who is in charge of the child welfare system. More importantly and critically, without the safety net of child welfare, children can die, okay? At the same time, we can't remain complacent. Relying on deference to authority or did you do the things without changing your behavior like the old way of child welfare is not good enough. It's not preventing enough maltreatment, it's not changing enough lives, it's not keeping enough children safe, and it's also oppressive. It's hurting people and it's creating the problems that feel toxic and toxic enough that people are running away from the child welfare system. So we have to change. The real question is, what on earth is it that we want? Right? This is a long quote by Jerry Milner. He was the commissioner for the Children's Bureau at the time the Family First Prevention Services Act was passed as recently as 2017. I told you this was a system in development. It's developing just as less than 5 years ago, right? A major piece of legislation that shifted the federal stream of money that usually comes that's attached to how many children are in foster care and now shifts it to can we do prevention work with communities so that we can prevent children entering foster care. It's trying to think upstream, it's trying to think community-based, it's trying to deal with the issues before they erupt, and it's using federal dollars, which used to be all tied up into just paying for foster care, to fund that work. This is a dramatic sea change in child welfare, okay? It has the capacity to address many of the ills that I've described today, but it can't be implemented without the engagement and guidance of folks who knows what works in social work. We can't just be like, here communities, have all the millions and do stuff with it, right? That's not gonna work, at least not in the short term, okay? So, let's start with community. Okay? All neighborhoods and communities have strengths and resources, whether amongst its residents and local businesses, community organizations, or religious institutions. Even the most under-resourced communities have pockets of creativity, hope, and mutual support. And these individuals and groups care about their kids, and they know their residents' needs more than anyone. They live in the struggle every day. They're primed to identify the unique challenges faced by children and families that live in those neighborhoods. And they can help in ways that feel empowering and non-stigmatizing in a way that formalized government-operated child welfare maybe can't, okay? The fact that communities have become sidelined over the years on issues of child protection isn't just because they didn't care or they're disorganized, it's also because we bureaucratized and actually criminalized a lot of child welfare work, so we pushed communities out. We gotta bring those puppies back in because they are a natural source of real strength for both children and families and those broader communities. However, community may be willing and able, but they're looking for an invitation and guidance on how on earth to do it, okay? They're not doing this work, not at the scale that we need it right now. You know, that church might be having a fatherhood group or might be, you know, sponsoring visitation time. Maybe they host an AA meeting, but they don't know how to do all that stuff that we just spent an hour and a half talking about, okay? Given the legacy of racism and discrimination of a country's histories, many community members are themselves struggling to survive and thrive. When we join with them, channeling funding, developing structures and processing, identifying gaps in services, nurturing best practices, establishing criteria to determine whether services are effective or not, we're building something new. We're standing in the gap for communities and the children and the families that we serve. We take those groups and we make them stronger, okay? There's no existing community-based referral or engagement system for families in crisis to access community supports. Almost all things travel through the child welfare system. So even on a very basic level, if community wanted to do it all, how do they and the families connect so that they can? We need to help build that up, okay? Furthermore, the types of funding that they need to build the type of programming that would be necessary, evidence-based substance abuse treatment, evidence-based domestic violence treatment, all of the rest of it, they don't have. They're not currently running evidence-based, validated, things. They have these kind of informal networks of support that help some things, mainly with concrete supports, but those behavioral challenges are very difficult for any community member to know how to enter that fray and to have the skills and expertise that are necessary to do it well. Okay? All child welfare work is supported through federal, state, and local funds. Communities need support accessing that funds in the right ways for the right resources so that they can seed and build up their capacity to provide the services that are necessary. Finally, evidence all over the place show that even when community members are providing services, families aren't taking advantage of those services. There is a certain thing that I mentioned earlier that we'd like parents to kind of join us and recognize their needs, but they don't. And so there's a certain amount of involuntary support, at least at the onset, that needs to grow into voluntary support. If community members haven't received training and education in how to engage, how to meet and build rapport with an involuntary client, then clients come in and leave and they just sort of wave as they go by, right? Well, that's not going to stop the pattern of abuse and neglect either. We need to be able to imbue people with the ability of serving in a way that compels that participation. And I'm going to lean hard on that engagement framework of saying there's a lot of good stuff in there, but most people don't have the skills to do it. In short, I have no doubt that communities have the capacity in the long term to protect children, but they're not there yet. They're nowhere near there yet. They need support, and they need support from professionals and experts in child welfare. I'm hoping to build that through you guys. Finally, anti-oppressive. An examination of child welfare data tells that the current system is not producing desired outcomes. Nobody's happy with it, okay? Hundreds of thousands of children are reported every year. Many don't receive any support beyond the report and the investigation. No services are provided, okay? Many others become involved in the child welfare system only to have an enormously long case that lasts forever and doesn't necessarily end in the right outcomes. Earlier, you saw a slide with the permanency outcomes for many children. About a year and a half, and even after 3 years, there's still about 20% of children don't go home to any type of home at all. All right. Moreover, Black and Native American children not only experience disproportional surveillance from child welfare system, but also disparate outcomes. Pretty much any outcome that you track, African American children have worse outcomes, right? So they're not receiving the types of support that they need. To turn this tide, child welfare systems need to partner with and empower communities. We need to be held accountable. Okay? We need to invite and empower people to come to the table and to help us understand when we're missing things, right? When we are biased, when we don't understand things, when we're not seeing things clearly, or sources of community support that are going to keep children safe. It requires a little bit of leveling those power imbalances and creating safe spaces for community partners to engage. I right now am involved very deeply in some work that's happening in Los Angeles County. And one of the things that I've seen in Los Angeles County that's been really, really exciting is the degree to which not only do they invite community to the table, but they've empowered the community. The community is saying things that the system doesn't always want to hear, and they're saying that on individual cases and in a monthly sort of forum where they're fully invited, okay? When this practice sort of became sort of hyper involved and community members were being invited into these team meetings about individual cases, there was a lot of backlash from the child welfare staff. Who are these folks and why are they in my face, right? But slowly over time, what Los Angeles County is finding is that those conversations are leading to some really productive places, right? It's not just put that Black child back, but it's like, you're just not understanding that correctly, or like, that doesn't make any sense, or this is just how we do it, right? Like, for example, you know, multiple children in a bedroom. Some children sleeping on a couch, for example, right? To some of us, that might be like, you don't have enough space for your kids, you need more beds, or something like that. And folks are saying, no, I mean, we kind of do that. That's normal, you know, we're poor, and folks share beds, or some people sleep on the couch. And so don't judge the family, this isn't neglect, this is, you know, something else. Also, you know, you haven't really engaged dad, and holding social workers responsible for engaging and talking to that father. But for that to be working in the way that I see it working in Los Angeles right now, the community needed to be told that they were not only welcome, but wanted at the table, and that they were allowed to share their point of view. I've worked with a number of jurisdictions that invite community to the table, but it's usually like, hi community, can you help us recruit some foster parents? And that's the limit of what we want them to be involved, which is very nice, but that's not the same as empowering them to hold us accountable. Do we see the difference in those two things? All right, so wow, we did it. Let's bring this all home. Do you mind placing that document in the chat right now? All the work that is needed to protect children, empower families, and build a community-based child protection system requires you. This is a sales pitch, folks. You didn't know it. This was like posed as some intellectual, beautiful talk of an expert about the child welfare system, and I'm really just making a long sales pitch. All right? I strongly believe that the people in that Zoom room and in this room right here, as well as your extended connections at home, in your own communities, at your own places of work, have what it takes to support children in their communities and develop this new reality. I'm still exceedingly hopeful about where child welfare is going. It's never been great. It's always been a work in progress. In fact, it's done some pretty horrendous things. But it's pretty much a baby, and we're still nurturing this baby along. I believe in its adulthood will be a better thing, okay? To do it well, however, we need folks with specific skills. Skills in engagement, as we've learned, skills in assessment, including attention to a child and family's entire social ecology, skills in anti-oppressive and anti-racist practice, skills in developing and using evidence-based practices to address the social problems that we have in families, skills in community engagement and organizing, skills in building organizational capacity, and skills in policy development and analysis, amongst many others. It just so happens, and I accidentally skipped it, here it is, that we have an excellent educational program here at Berkeley to help you develop and refine those skills. Our Child Welfare Scholars Program is a Title IV public education program that not only teaches these skills but provides a social work practicum in your second year with a county or state or a tribal organization so that you can experience the child welfare system firsthand. I invite you to take a look at this website. It's been provided in the chat. We can provide it to those others, right? I would also love to talk to each and every one of you about the program. I got an MSW and a PhD right here in this old building, and so I got plenty of thoughts and insights about what it can offer you and how you can help build a better child welfare system. So I thank you for your time today. I really appreciate folks showing up for this talk, for hearing, at least in the blurb, my plea to not abandon this child welfare system, which I feel is critical to the safety of children, and to believe a little bit in its potential. It's definitely not where it needs to be right now. The reason I go to work every single day with a lot of joy in my heart is because I actually feel like I'm a reformer in the child welfare system, using data for that purpose. And so come and join me, my colleagues, and the wonderful individuals who are out there right now doing this work, okay? And let's build this new child welfare system.